Beyond Resilience is a series of curated conversations created by Firelight with the purpose of exploring the challenges, strategies, and experiences of creating and distributing work during a time of crisis.
Nobody's going to give us any power until we ask for it, until we demand it.
The role of storytellers right now is to tell those stories that people are refusing to tell, and to do so in a transparent manner.
It is critical to me that my team, again, reflect the community that we are going to be talking about, or the community that is the subject.
There are so many missing narratives in the Black experience that would do so much to help both the understanding of Black people in our current situation, but also other people who are trying to understand what's going on.
The decision makers need to change. It is not okay that this small group of white folks are the ones who determine which stories matter, which filmmakers matter, and decide and set the terms on which these stories are made. That is literally what has gotten us to the place that we are in.
We're talking about systemic change, not a one-time grant to a couple of organizations. That's what we need.
I want to thank all of you for joining us today. We have all been very excited about this panel, and I'm going to turn it over to Don Young, who is our moderator.
We're thrilled to be co-hosting this event with Firelight Media as part of their Beyond Resilience series and part of our CAAMFest Filmmaker Summit. Just briefly, I'm in Palo Alto, the land of the Ohlone people. My visual background is a downstairs room. I'm a middle-aged man with gray hair, and it might get grayer in this conversation, but we are thrilled to be hosting this today. Just briefly, I wanted to provide a few opening remarks because I think we're at a pivotal time in this system. Again, this is a system we all care for. We certainly hope that this conversation will be the start of, a handful where we can really dig in and make this all better for a system we all deeply care for. So, to start off with, we at CAAM are proudly part of public media, but also recognize its shortcomings and seek to do our best to help make it thrive and move forward. As we were planning for this conversation, it occurred to me simultaneously, some of the highest highs of my career have been in public media, yet some of the most troubling low points have also happened here too, especially with well-compensated executives complacent about whether diversity was part of their personal mandate. Last year, a colleague recalled to me how she had been treated, and it rang so true to me. They choose not to see you. I think we should sit with that for a second, and think through how much our system has lost with such blatant betrayal of values. Many of us here fight on because we believe more in the fundamental promise and mandate of public television than those more interested in spicing up a menu, so to speak. These are conversations so many creative communities of color have amongst ourselves, but now we must open it with the system that we all care for. Can we all have a discussion together, be honest, open, and constructive? I am personally very emboldened by so many of the new hires at PBS, CPB, and our panel colleagues like Cameo George here too. But can we situate this better for all of them to thrive? Let's hold this discussion as if public media is here in the room to listen. Finally, in the Hollywood Reporter last week, Ava DuVernay said 2 to 3 years ago, she decided not to do these sorts of panels anymore. And instead, she said, I was going to make something happen, and not just for myself, but to try to really invigorate the systems that lock us into this and try to chip away at them, understand them, maneuver around them, through them, over them, under them, whatever it was going to be. So with that spirit, let's start the panel. So I'd like to bring in this really distinguished group of exceptional storytellers, but equally great members of public media family and community leaders. So I'd like to welcome Stanley Nelson, Grace Lee, Bernardo Ruiz, and Cameo George. So welcome everybody, as everybody's digitally arriving. I wanted to do really brief introductions with a story, and then we can get into a general conversation. But Stanley, I wanted to start with you. You know, in 2016, when you were awarded the Lifetime Award at the News and Doc Emmys, it was fall of 2016, before Donald Trump was elected. And certainly for myself, I think a lot of us in the field, you know, your acceptance speech really triggered a lot of just really opened our minds up, where you talked about the unstoppable future. And, you know, I think, you know, to set the tone for today's conversation, you know, you as a filmmaker, you and Marcia through Firelight have equally carried the responsibility of making amazing work. But parallel, you've wanted to create the strategy of creating generations after generations together, a sort of village of a community that, you know, public media has had the privilege to really, I think, build with. Can you speak about this moment and sort of, you know, where we are right now, and what, both in the context of what you've committed to and what we can all do for public television?
Great. Thank you so much. It's great to be here. I'm on the land of the Lenape people. I think that, you know, I'm just very positive about the future, and I think we have to remain positive about the future, although we're hit by a lot of negatives. You know, I think that PBS is at a great crossroads. I think that people of color are a way to really ingest some energy into the system, and the system really needs that energy. It's also a huge audience, an untapped audience at PBS. You know, there's not great programming, you know, for the African American community, for the Latino community, for the Asian community, on other channels, and so that it really is a place for people of color, and I also think it's a place for and a time for PBS to reinvigorate its mission. You know, its mission was to create change and to program new and different kind of media, and I think, and to be experimental. And I think that really we have to understand that for so much of its time, you know, PBS has kind of slowly leaned towards being complacent and being too normal. And I think that one of the things that we can do is start trying to break that up and create, you know, new and exciting programming at PBS.
Thank you, Stanley. Next up, I'd like to introduce Grace Lee. Grace was the hardest for me to prepare for because we've been peers since almost the very beginnings of our career. But I did want to acknowledge and celebrate last year, Grace, you had 5 hours of programming on the PBS Primetime. CAAM was really, I think, fortunate to be a part of all of it, right? From our historic Asian American series, as well as And She Could Be Next. You know, I think in some ways, last year was a watershed for you as a filmmaker, but also, you know, you really came out strong in terms of articulating, I think, a voice that a lot of communities of color and independent filmmakers felt in regards to public media. You know, can you talk about that, having the year that you had, but also why was it that you felt the need to articulate a certain kind of vision in regards and conversation around public media?
Well, thanks, Don, and thanks, Firelight, for having this conversation here. You know, to echo Stanley's unstoppable future, you know, when I was asked by Ford Foundation to think about the future of documentary, and I was thinking about all of the work I've been doing that has appeared on PBS, you know, as somebody who works in, you know, looks at history, it's hard not to look at the future and then also look at the past and see how the past has almost prevented, or at least, you know, sort of, the past is something. PBS is stuck in the past. Basically, that's what I want to say. You know, one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this, you know, publicly alongside members of Beyond Inclusion Collective, is that this system needs to change. I mean, for so long we have been, you know, kind of complacently kind of going along with the status quo. And, you know, this affects what we're asking for in terms of PBS to change is just proportional access, proportional resources, proportional marketing money, so that it does actually meet its mission, you know, so that it does actually lean into the diversity of perspectives that it purports to do. One thing I wanted to bring up is if people have been following the Beyond Inclusion Collective, you know, so many people don't think about how much power, so people don't even understand what PBS is about and how several stations have so much power within the system, WGBH, WNET, WIDA, you know, how these three stations control so much or produce so much of what is on PBS primetime, on the PBS primetime schedule. So, you know, if you go to BIPOC Makers, our Twitter handle, you'll see that we just published a flyer of the corporate leadership that doesn't actually meet the moment that we're talking about. So, you know, I just want to, you know, I'm happy for this conversation, but I think we really need to like focus on the present in order to get to that unstoppable future.
Sure, and where we want and need to go, right?
Yeah.
So. Next up, I'd like to introduce Bernardo Ruiz, who, you know, as we were prepping for the conversation, he didn't recognize it, but I'd like to introduce him, you know, really as in the context of our PBS family, a pillar from the Latino community. Right? So, you know, so many of his projects have really addressed the big important themes, the conversations between Latinos, Latin America, the US, right? From education to voting, journalism, the drug trade, right? All of that. And I was surprised actually that that hadn't really necessarily come to his attention, right? For many years, better part of a decade, I would see Bernardo at the PBS annual meetings and, you know, regarded him as a peer and sort of like the young, you know, we're all part of this tweener group where we're old and young at the same time, right? Still trying to scrap and move it forward, but also, you know, I think you mentioned in our prep conversation, we're also at a pivotal moment where you do bounce between commercial media, but also have been firmly part of public media, right? So if you could talk about, you know, briefly, what public media has meant to you, but where you hope and believe this conversation can help take us.
Well, first of all, I'll confirm that I'm definitely not that young. So Don, I think we're on another side of things, but you know, we've been having these conversations I've been participating in these conversations for about 2 decades. You know, beginning in 2000, where one of my first production jobs was as an associate producer for Orlando Bagwell on a 4-part series called Matters of Race. And that experience was instrumental for me because it was a kind of production school. It was both a production job, so it was both a way for me to earn a living, but it was also a training ground. And for me, unfortunately, that model, I haven't been able to replicate that model, nor have I been able to participate in a similar model. To me, that was the best kind of training, that on the job training, where Orlando sent me into the field to do my very first field piece, to work with crews, and it was built into the DNA of his company at the time to think about diversity not as an add-on, but as a kind of core part of the value of the company. So for me, that was an inspiration and a kind of a guide for the work that I wanted to do for the last 2 decades. And as you've mentioned, it's true. I think certainly my generation of filmmakers, just out of necessity, many of us have had to move to working for the for-profit networks and streamers. I mean, just in the last few years, I've done work for HBO and Disney Plus and ESPN. And while that's exciting, I do continue to return to public media because I believe that the kind of work that we all do, that is work about science, art, culture, politics, that work is best when it reaches the most diverse, the most broad audience possible, and that it be free and that it be part of the public commons. So that's why, you know, I'm so honored to support my fellow colleagues and people that I've been looking up to for years, because there is a responsibility that public media has that's different than the commercial and for-profit streamers. I also think we do work in a different way. There's greater potential for outreach and impact, and I think that's a very different experience than the for-profit streamers.
Thank you. And last but not least, Cameo George. I think you just officially went through your first PBS annual meeting, right? So you are now officially a veteran. In planning this conversation, we always wanted to have somebody. I consider myself part of public media, but certainly not on the scrappy side. But Cameo, when I reached out to you, I wrote you late one night, and I heard from you the next morning. I think it speaks volumes in terms of you being here, wanting to be a part of the conversation. And I have to say, when I saw you at the PBS annual meeting talking, I was really moved. I was surprised to see this sea of change, and it was very, it was just really gratifying to see that, right? So, all due respect, wanting to welcome you. I think the goal for all of this is that, with the next generation of our system, I think we all believe our job, our responsibility is to build this better. But that, I'm sure you feel pressure, but all of us want to do our best to help you succeed. Right? So, and what I wanted to share really briefly was our first interaction, because I think it speaks volumes about what you're trying to do, right? So just briefly, you reached out to me and said, hello, and a request for help from American experience. I am eager to open the door to a wider and more diverse cadre of filmmakers and broaden the definition of what entails an American experience worth covering. I am hoping you can help me in my mission on both counts. And I have to say, I paused for a moment, not sure exactly how to respond, and not sure what was going on. And then taking a breath, and then we started talking shop about what to do next, right? So, it's with that spirit. We're really happy to have you here, and we all want to work together.
Well, I'm really happy to be here, especially with this cadre of people on this stage. I have to say, I've been at PBS almost a year now, so I'm still quite new. Went to my first annual meeting, as you said, but I've had interactions with each person on the stage already. Some I have a longer relationship with, like Stanley. But I think it's important for me to say that while I've only been at PBS for less than a year, I have been a producer and a filmmaker, director, reporter, journalist for more than 20 years. And I have had all of these same conversations at all of the other places that I've worked. So I get it. And I feel the same way. And that's why it was important for me to be a part of this conversation. I want to do a good job in representing PBS for sure, but I also think these are important conversations, and I've been on both sides of the conversation, and so I'm hoping we get into a lot today.
So why don't we dig in a little bit? What might success look like? What are models we think we want to talk about? Let's just sort of popcorn and like what are, maybe starting with you, Cameo, going back to you, like what are some of the projects, like how are you approaching the work in the context of public media? What are sort of what are you sort of working towards?
Well, it's interesting that you read some of my email. I'm not sure that that's appropriate. You're putting me on the spot.
I know, and I'm sorry. Yeah, and I
all these months ago. But no, but what I said in that email was genuine, and that really was my approach from the day one that I walked in the door at PBS. For me, success looks like having all of you and all of our BIPOC colleagues feel comfortable approaching PBS with projects. It's having decision makers at PBS feel comfortable and motivated in approaching you with projects. It's having my team look like the rest of America. It's having a slate of films for American experience every season that that is reflective and representative. It's, you know, it's really being able to walk into a room with filmmakers and not have them feel like, ugh, you know, this is lip service, right? Like, I want people to feel like this is a place where they can do some of their best work. So honestly, I feel like my goals are very much the same as all of your goals. And I will say that I don't think that that's just me. I think that that's Frontline, that's Nova, you know, I know that's Independent Lens and POV, not that I'm speaking for everyone, but I do know that there are people at all of those shops who want the same thing. I will say that, as I said before, for me, it is a personal mission, you know, as one of the only BIPOC executive producers. So it's a special onus or burden on me, that, not burden, because it's something that I put on myself that I want, but I know that I'm not the only one who feels this way within the system.
Yeah, and I would say, based on the last half a year of the conversations, at least CAAM's been able to be a part of, there is a real desire from the strands and national leadership to advance the conversation. Perhaps we can exist in this gray area where the question isn't so much whether the commitment's there, but how far, what is the plan, and how far do we take this, right?
I just want to also, yeah, I just want to acknowledge that I know there are people like Cameo reached out to me after I wrote that essay, which I thought was amazing. You know, we had a great conversation. It's the first time anybody in my entire, like, 20 years of making films on PBS ever did something like that. And I think it's important to note that, you know, when you change the face of leadership, you actually change what the leadership sees and who they value and you know, what they bring to the table. And, you know, I think that's something that it is a burden, actually. I mean, it is a burden. It's for all the, in particular, I think, women of color in the PBS system. We see you. I just want to acknowledge, like, Sylvia Bugg, Wendy Lenis, all these folks, you know, who have been supporting the project that I've been part of. You know, I know they see me, but they're very few and far between, right? And this is something this is one of the reasons why Beyond Inclusion, you know, is talking not just about the makers, not just about the emerging makers who are going to be the next generation, but the current generation. We're here and we have invested in this system really heavily and have a lot of insight to bring to the table. So, you know, I just also want to appreciate Cameo and all that you do. But just to say that it is a burden when the whole system needs a complete overhaul.
Stanley, Bernardo, what thoughts do you have in terms of what we can be working towards?
I think one of the words that occurred to me is just, you know, intentionality. I mean, you know, PBS has to do this with intentionality, and I think one of the things that we've seen in the last year is starting to change a little bit. You know, the New York Times, I want to say, if anybody reads the New York Times, you know, all of a sudden they've discovered Black folks, you know, and Asian folks, you know, and so that. I think that the last year has been a slap in the face, but also you have to have intention to change, to really change. And so I think that, and you have to understand that you're not changing to try to give anybody a gift, but you're changing so that you can do your job better. You know, and your job is to program, have exciting program and diverse programming. So I think that you know, just intentionality was just a thought that occurred to me, and also I think that one of the things that PBS needs to also talk about is how do you develop and hold talent. and that's really the thing. I think, as Bernardo was talking about, working for other people, and I've had to work for other people because there's and so many people that we work with in the lab who come out of the documentary lab. They make a great film at PBS, but there's nowhere else to go. Or it takes so long, to go to the next film. So that I think really, holding on to this great cadre of talent that begins at PBS, and that really PBS needs to look at them as resources for the future.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I would just, I think Grace's essay was so important because it sharply articulated something that had been in part of our conversation as independents for quite some time. I'm glad that it was supported by a foundation, although, if we're going to be transparent, the foundations have also played a role in propping up the current legacy model. So I think that's a conversation to be had as well. We can talk about leadership, we can talk about pipelines, but the funding ecosystem has also propped up the existing model. And I think we're all in agreement that this is a moment where there's an opportunity for change, both in terms of the diversity of makers, but also aesthetic and storytelling diversity, which is, I think, something we're all interested in. What I would like to do and what I would like to see is, as an aging mid-career maker, I'm really excited to support my fellow makers and to see what kind of, what we can begin to build, whether it's new series. I'm grateful for the existing legacy series, and I think they can do a lot of good in terms of education. But I also think this is an opportunity to build something new, to think about new aesthetic approaches, and maybe build a different kind of spaces in public media. So, all we can do is push, but as an independent producer who's been a part of many of these different conversations, I want to support my fellow makers who want to get, series off the ground, and to try to open up the creative space for makers of color, so that they're not, the community isn't always having to do one type of story, but so that that makers can think about craft and can think about different approaches. I think that would be exciting to see more of as well.
So when I came into the system, it was in the mid-90s, and I'd heard a lot of very specific concrete examples of production fellowships. So I would hear in the context of a place like KQED, where so many of the Bay Area feature film documentary talent would go through, like KQED Newsroom. There were really robust, specific opportunities for folks to cut their teeth, get their first steps into the system, and in fact, were really trained to be filmmakers at that time. Like, what are some of the very specific models or constructs that should be considered in terms of deliberately providing entryways for filmmakers, and specifically targeting communities who we all need to hear more from?
It's interesting that we're having this conversation at CAAMFest, Center for Asian American Media. All of us know about the National Multicultural Alliance. When you think about how the system is set up, the fact that the National Multicultural Alliance has to exist kind of assumes that these perspectives are not baked into the original system, right? And I think that's something that we should really think about. Like, oftentimes BIPOC content, BIPOC makers are kind of corralled into, and making films about Asian Americans. Don't get me wrong, I loved working on the Asian American series, and there's nothing I wanted to do more. But, how do we break out of these kinds of boxes that we've been put in, right? Similarly, anyway, I'll just say that.
Just jump in and say what I think is so interesting about that idea. is that there's no easy answer. Like, again, I said that, I spent my career on the broadcast and commercial side at CNN and NBC and ABC and all these other places. And at some points in the 20 years, I was part of teams that only did stories on underrepresented communities, on communities of color, just whatever kind of marginalized communities. But then there were other times in my career, particularly earlier on, where I felt like, no, I don't want to do those stories. I mean, I want to do those stories, but I don't want to, I'm wary of doing those stories because I don't want to get pigeonholed, right? And so there's like this tug of war where you're trying to figure out what you should do. But then I just thought about earlier this year, American Experience, we had a sort of fireside chat with Stanley, and I asked him the question, should non-BIPOC people do BIPOC stories? He was like, nope. Next question. And it was this amazing, freeing answer, and I got so much commentary from people about that. Some people who were sort of hurt and felt like, well, but I'm progressive or this or that, like I should be able to tell all stories. And it's like, absolutely, everyone should be able to tell all stories. However, if there are fewer of those stories and fewer of those opportunities, like we should be first in line as BIPOC creators. But it's just interesting what you're saying, Grace, and I always remember Stanley's answer because there aren't enough of these stories to go around. So it is sort of my inclination, if I have a story on Asian America, that I want an Asian American filmmaker to do it because I know that they are empathetic and want to do that story, but it's tricky.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what in some ways, I think, what Grace is saying is that, but we should be considered to do other stories besides, African American stories. And I have to say that just to make it real, I think that in some ways I'm in a privileged position, and I'm in a position where if somebody asks me, should white folks be doing films films about people of color, I can just say nope. And I don't have to hedge my bets that a younger filmmaker may have to do. But, I mean, that's something that we believe at Firelight, that we believe that people need to tell their own stories and that they should tell their own stories and that they can tell their own stories better than anybody else can tell their stories. That again, that we can dive deep in the water, and go under the water and where someone else coming to the community is sailing on top of the water, and surfing through the film. So that's really what we believe, and that we try to put that to work, over and over again.
And then bringing it back to this particular conversation, how intentional does public media, public television have to have a strategy in relation to how certain communities tell stories, and what are we investing in, and what is our brand, and what differentiates how we do our work differently from other networks or streamers, right? Maybe if we can drill down into that a little bit, when during certainly the first golden era of public media, really the great generations of documentarians started in public media in so many ways, right? Now we have so much competition. We certainly hear that there are challenges in terms of garnering the resources. Can we pinpoint a little bit more focus? Like what does distinguish? Maybe the question is, what distinguishes public media, and what we think we could be investing in?
Well, I mean, I'm just gonna, there's a question in the chat. Someone said, how could PBS not understand the terrible optics of the 8 Hours of Ali being made by Ken Burns, his daughter and son-in-law? I mean, what are the values of PBS? Are we meeting the moment? Are we, who gets to have that kind of decision-making power about what films they want to work on? I mean, we were talking about this earlier, but very few, I don't know who else gets to do that. Very few people within the system get that kind of power or access. I mean, Stanley, I don't know if you get to pitch whatever you want and get funded, but do you? I'm not sure. But.
No, I mean, I think the reality of PBS is that certain filmmakers bring resources to PBS, and if they bring resources to PBS, they get kind of carte blanche and can make a film that on the surface seems so abnormal. I can't think of the right word, as Ken Burns doing 8 hours on Muhammad Ali. But Ken Burns brings resources to PBS, and he's able to do in some way whatever he wants. And so I mean I'm glad you brought that up, Grace, because it does seem kind of a strange bedfellows, and I know people I talk to in the African American community are like, what? Okay, and I'm sure that it'll be professionally done. Right, it'll be professionally done, and it'll be well done. But is it a film? Can Ken Burns on some level ever understand what Muhammad Ali meant to African Americans? I don't think so.
And the question you say, like, he can bring resources to PBS. Why? How did that happen? Why is he the one that's able to bring these kind of resources? Because he has guaranteed distribution, for decades in terms of getting whatever he wants to, be on public television, I mean, the amount of resources and marketing and budget and time, who else gets that, right? I mean, if we're going to talk about, making this a more equitable system, with a diversity of perspectives, we have to question what's happening, what has been established as precedent.
And I think to that point, Grace, I think there's been that history of what was considered objective, quote unquote, objective storytelling. I know that one statement that Ken Burns has made repeatedly is that he's not interested in quote unquote activist filmmaking. And so I think the idea, maybe the frame of what is a certain kind of nonfiction storytelling that's adjacent to journalism and what is considered activist filmmaking, I think sometimes by just taking on topics that are neglected historically by the legacy series, filmmakers are automatically branded as quote unquote activists, simply by highlighting perspectives or issues that were overlooked or intentionally excluded. So I think that piece is also important. I mean, I think the financing piece is critical, as everyone has discussed, but then there's also this idea that this conversation that is also happening in journalism about who gets to cover what story. And this is something I come up against all the time as a Mexican-American mestizo filmmaker. If I touch on immigration, I'm frequently told that I'm too close to the story, or that I somehow am incapable of being objective about this because my father came to this country as an immigrant seeking other, opportunities. So I think that is also part of the legacy that public media needs to grapple with, and again that the foundations I think need to deal with for propping up some of that, some of the existing architecture.
Mm-hmm. So what are some possible next steps? There will be, a series of conversations that will start in public media that I think there's an openness and a willingness. But what in the context of the creative community, like what are some specific steps we can work towards and begin to create in terms of interface and mechanisms for conversations?
I mean, once again, like the labor that we have been assigned to figure this out, that's not our job. I mean, yes, we have thoughts we've been invested in this system for a long time, but, there are plenty of people getting paid, to figure out how to make this system better. I don't know. I feel like as a filmmaker of color, as someone, all of us here have done activism, we've done organizing for our own communities, because like Bernardo, I was also trained, like you, Don, by Lonnie Ding, this veteran Asian American producer, to kind of, give back to the community. We give so much, to our own communities, to the documentary field, but, do we have to figure everything out? It's like,
well, I think if we wouldn't be here if we weren't committed to moving something forward, right? I think it is maybe just from a personal perspective, back in, I felt that when Stanley did his the Emmy Award speech, it came at a perfect time for me. I can give some personal perspective of, in 2016, we were about halfway through the Asian American series. I mean, we first started talking with Rita back in 2012. And there was a lot of arm wrestling and hard conversations about authorship. Whose story was it to tell? Who had the experience of seeing it through? Candidly, who would fund it? And around that time, we just weren't sure what could happen, because it was we were spending so much time trying to figure out the partnership, the construct, the mechanisms, that it was actually distracting us from producing what we set out to do. But when you're able to claim that power and figure out also how to work together, I can say in the context of WIDA and the process, we eventually landed to a partnership that really was robust. And I think there was, I sort of equate my specific relationship with Jeff Bieber as like all of those Rocky movies where, like Apollo Creed and Rocky Balboa, there's a place that when you really go to battle, but you find something at the end of that you create, that you're proud of, that you really feel like is special on behalf of your community and the system, you want to dig back into that, right? So I do, maybe that's a certain kind of naive optimism that I have, that like we're here because we want this to go somewhere. We're committed to making it better. So I do want to challenge that conversation of like, what is it that we're here because we want it to go somewhere, that there's a claim we want to stake. So, I just want to push back on that of like, what, not necessarily we all have to burden, not our community, but what would we like to see, and how can we bring our part to that conversation to move it forward?
Well, I think that's why Beyond Inclusion asks for the data, in order, if we all have different perspectives, we have our own histories that we bring to this conversation, but the facts and data, how much spending has been, how much funding has been allocated to BIPOC makers versus white filmmakers, budgets, marketing resources. When we can look at that, we can have a clear and honest conversation about how to move forward. And that's all we're asking. I mean, that's, because we have such, coming from very different perspectives. I remember those conversations, I was part of them in Asian Americans, but, we need to start from the same level to understand how do we move forward, right?
Mm-hmm. Sure. Access to resources, that's a critical, the data. What else specifically, like, can we come away with some initial priorities or a list of possible working ideas to start from?
And I would echo what Grace is saying about the need for data and the importance of that. And I think that's one place where public media does have a unique responsibility. For instance, Netflix as a private company, is known for not necessarily providing the type of, data that creators want, but public media has a different responsibility. So I think that as a baseline is very important. I think you have to acknowledge the remarkable work that Firelight has been doing in terms of constructing an infrastructure for people, building that pipeline, I think the question that I have and many others have now is like, where does all of that talent go? And I think rather than seeing it as a burden or a problem, public media needs to think about how can we harness this talent to build new types of programming and reach new audiences and kind of step boldly into the future, not to do it with fear. It's always this issue that this is not a burden, but this is an opportunity. This is and that other platforms that maybe don't have the same type of social commitment are definitely going to snap up that talent if public media doesn't make some bold decisions. The world is moving quickly. Culture is moving quickly, and I see it in my own career, and I see it in the career of emerging filmmakers behind me.
It's already happening.
Yeah.
I mean, it's already happening. I mean, most young filmmakers are more excited they want to pitch to Netflix, or these other platforms, not necessarily PBS. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be here, right? There are other platforms, and they're going to be here, but there's a reason, and very honestly, there's a reason why certain projects belong on PBS and belong at PBS, and we try to tell filmmakers that all the time in the doc lab, so I think that PBS again can be much better at developing talent and keeping talent, because when I started making documentary films, PBS was the only game in town. I mean, literally, it was the only game in town. HBO didn't even exist. I'm that old. So, but now there's other places, and they're very aggressive, and we really need for PBS to hold this talent. When we started the doc lab, one of the things, 12 years ago, one of the things that we jumped into it with was there's enough BIPOC filmmakers out there to have great projects and great skills, and to keep that this thing is really viable, and it's only been proven over and over again by the filmmakers, the incredible films and filmmakers that we've worked with, and probably, I don't know, 90% of them are have made projects for PBS, but we've struggled to help them get to their next film, like the talent isn't nurtured in the same way as other places, and that's really critical.
Yeah, I mean, speaking from CAAM, look, we are part of public media because it's a system we care for. There isn't another outlet for Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders, so we double down in this space. I do believe that with the crop, you look at ADOC, it's over 800 filmmakers in one community alone, that the opportunities, that the amount of storytellers, and all that they can bring is amazing, right? We can't certainly answer all of this for every filmmaker, but we can be intentional in terms of what we design and commit to, right? So, Cameo, not at all to put you specifically on the pressure, but in your short time in public media, like what do you think are the real concrete, specific kinds of opportunities that you think we can all start to think through?
I mean, I think that I don't want to say, I don't want to just echo what other people are saying, but to me, just as a new person who's trying to absorb all of this information, transparency is key. Accountability is key. We're having conversations amongst the EP ranks to try to figure out okay, what data should we be publishing every year? I feel very comfortable saying I have 10 films per season. This is how many films were done by African Americans. This is how many were done by Asian Americans. This is how many were done by Latinx directors. I don't know if everyone would agree to do that, but I certainly would. I don't think that I'm the only one. I mean, I think that it's people are saying this in the chat, knowledge is power. And so I think that's important. But I can also say, even for me as an EP, I want the same marketing and promotion and system-wide support that Hemingway gets for The Blinding of Isaac Woodard, which is a film that we did just a couple of months ago, a really powerful, important film that, I hope that people will continue to watch and stream, and we decide when all of the news was focusing on this latest rash, not new, but latest rash of anti-Asian violence. Like, we went into our vault and pulled out the Chinese Exclusion Act and figured out, okay, can we re-clear it? Can we relicense it? Can we get it onto the air? Can we create a virtual event around it? Like, what?
Which was really popular. Yeah, which was perfectly.
I mean, it's had more than 13,000 views on YouTube already, which in the grand scheme of things may not seem like a lot to people, but for a virtual event for PBS, like, that's an astonishing number. And it says something. Like, I think that it is proof of concept. And so I think that while I agree with Grace that it shouldn't always be on the shoulders of the non-dominant cast, to use the newly popular phrase, to do the work and to figure out the solutions. Like, I do think that part of the conversation should be making demands and saying, I want to know, like, who's getting what slice of the pie, because again, even on the inside, like, I want to know that, I want that same access too, because the resources are not distributed evenly and in my not always equitably. So I think that that's important, really not giving up on the fight to get transparency, to get data, to have people say, like, I mean, quotas are, sort of controversial, that sometimes people don't agree with them, but like, maybe we should be saying, like, I want, if there are 100 films, like, I want 25% of them always to be done by this group, or 50. How about that? 50%.
Yeah. Goals and targets should be intentional, and plans should be.
I think you're also, Cameo, I think you're also, when you talked about, bringing these films back out, you're talking about cultivating audiences, this viewers like us, hashtag that Beyond Inclusion uses a lot is, who is America? Like, who are the people who are going to tune into PBS and watch these programs? Like, Don, not to put you on the spot, but because we're friends and we're at CAAMFest, I mean, Asian Americans was incredibly successful. It's so relevant in this moment in particular, and getting, so much acclaim. But is there any conversation about, like, a second Asian American series? Like, we got 5 hours, right? Like, where is that conversation? Is that conversation happening? I mean, there is a huge need and desire for this kind of programming, and audiences want it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say in the context of CAAM, look, the series, just as an example, and not at all to toot horn, but to provide some, concrete example. I think for our community, I mean, we've seen, Grace, maybe 3 filmmakers, very distinguished filmmakers, try to seek out to do a comprehensive historical series, right? We were fortunate enough to be a part of it. We had to work with partners. It couldn't come at a better time. There's been a wide awakening for Asian Americans, in particular in this last year. Now, whether or not that's going to result in resources for telling more of these stories, I think there's an outstanding question for our own community, what resources we bring to the table and are committed to. But it's also an ongoing conversation with the public media. I think robustly, the amount of impact that the series and these other web series and other work that we've done is astounding. But I think that comes also in the context of hatred and, in a moment, and that doesn't address what hasn't come up until now, right? So again, I think we are excited about what comes next. These conversations in this last year has emboldened all of us to be more forceful and deliberate about what claim we want to stake, right? So why don't we, I think some of the questions have been addressed a little bit, but why don't we address, before we have closing statements, what can PBS learn from platforms like Netflix, HBO, and others? Like, what can we bring from outside of public media into how we do our work?
I think one thing that I'm paying a lot of attention to, and I think we should all be paying attention to, is when we do get those gems and and are able to produce content that will appeal to these wider, more diverse audiences that we're striving for, like, we have to let people know that it's there, right? Like, the whole promotion and marketing monster is actually as important as making the content itself. You know, I spent a dozen years or more at CNN, and I remember when Anthony Bourdain's show first came to CNN, the marketing budget for each episode was bigger than my documentary budget for like 4 films in a season. And it's like, okay, I'm not saying that every film needs a $5 million marketing budget. Not everything has to be on the side of a bus and in the subway and, you know, wherever, but people need to know that it's there, right? Like, everyone's saying that we want these audiences, but it's like, okay, well, what are you going to do to go out and get them and to say like, hey, we have something that's for you? Like, you know, it's like, we can't have our projects be like trees falling in the forest. Like, that is an important part of it. And that should be talked about at the beginning, as early as when something is commissioned. Like, it shouldn't be an afterthought, because there's a lot of work that goes into building brand awareness and program awareness. So that's just one thing.
Yeah, I think that perspective is so appreciated, and a big example, I think, why many of us are really thrilled that Cameo is there at American Experience, breathing into that series. So I think, I mean, many of us in this group all know, and you can tell by the questions, I think the challenge for many independent producers has been kind of inventing the wheel each time, and the peculiarities of the system, having to do station relations. So I just would echo that, having full resources for BIPOC makers to have those kinds of marketing and the strategic marketing and outreach and engagement campaigns that really are the things that make the difference between something just, you know, kind of dying a quiet death online and really reaching the audiences it was meant to serve.
You know, you recently did that fabulous project on Michael Vick. You've done, you know, you're really starting to straddle different platforms and opportunities. What sort of wisdom can you bring to this?
I'm not sure if I can bring any wisdom to it. I think that, I mean, I think it's kind of a multi-tiered, you know, problem, a multi-tiered solution. You know, I think that in some ways it's a kind of a change of subject, but I think that in some ways, you know, PBS has to back up and kind of take a hard look at its total funding plan and how they fund films, you know, because I think in some ways what it slid into is if you can bring a known entity to PBS, right, and if you can bring some money with that known entity to PBS, then it's all systems go, right? And I don't think that that's what PBS wants to be. You know, if you step back and say, wait, is that what we want to be? Is that really who we want to be? I don't think that it would be. So I think that it's really important, you know, at this moment to kind of step back, because we're talking about, you know, major changes. You know, it's great that Cameo's there, and you know, it would be great if one of the other strands would hire a BIPOC person, you know, in charge. But that's not going to really change the system, you know, in the ways that it's a start. But, you know, but I think that that's not going to change the system in the ways that we want to. We have to kind of look at what the system has become. And I think that's really important.
Well, why don't we start? We have about 10 minutes left. You know, why don't we to close the panel with closing thoughts? I'm curious for each of you, if there's one takeaway that you'd like to share with public media, with PBS, with CPB, like what's one idea that you would like folks to think about, right? Like, what is it that you want people, the system, to start to really tackle and wrap its head on at this moment?
Um, Can you come back to me and think about it a little more?
Sure. Bernardo?
Thanks for putting me on the spot. No, listen, I think everyone who's participating in this conversation, and including, all of the participants who are asking questions, we're all interested in the future. I mean, that was Ford's, stated goal in commissioning these essays, and that's what we're trying to think about. And I think, as Stanley is saying, this is about taking a hard look at the system, looking at what's has just been inertia, what is just there because that's the way things have been done historically, and what we actually want to see. As an independent, I'd like to see more resources for independents of color, for series that highlight that, and not just for the existing legacy series, but for new spaces. I think that's important. Obviously, ITVS is a critical part of that conversation. What we now call the Multicultural Alliance are important. And maybe thinking about ways that those areas can be better integrated into the system as a whole, as opposed to these kind of pieces that are shunted off to one side. So I think when we need to have a concrete and specific conversation about the future and ways to support independence. And I think creating better workflows for more streamlined ways for independents to interface with the system, because it is an extreme, I say this as a mid-career veteran, it is a very challenging system, and it requires quite a bit of work if you're not a entity or a filmmaker who's pulling in corporate resources like Ken Burns. So I think thinking about that will be critical for PBS's future.
That's great.
I think that one of the things that PBS needs to do is just, step back and think about the mission. What is the mission? Netflix mission is to flood the market with enough stuff so that everybody everywhere in the world will have something on there that they can watch. Other networks' mission is to sell products. What is PBS's mission? What is the core bottom line? I think that to reassess and realign, it would not hurt at this point.
Great.
I'll just go back to the audience. Who is the audience? Like, if this is truly public media, what is public about it? If we're catering to, one of the things that always happens, for years, when people say, well, you have to think about, Milton and Mildred who might be watching this show, right? And what does that mean? I think that's really important because, I think I grew up watching PBS, and I know I was the audience at one point, and I'm also of a certain age, and that's something that, I had a kind of feeling about what PBS stood for, but I don't know if that applies anymore. We're in such a different time right now, and I think that is, I wonder what my child is not watching PBS for sure. And I just saw a really interesting comment in the chat. Somebody said, why did the Obamas go to Netflix as opposed to PBS? That's a really good question.
We'll have to leave that for another conversation. Thank you, Chiwe. But Cameo, do you have any thoughts, kind of closing thoughts?
I think my parting thought and something that I spend a lot of time thinking about and would like to continue doing is we have a lot of conversations about wanting this younger, more diverse audience. They're out there. We know that they're consuming content. We know that they care. They want to watch these films. They are energized by documentaries, by public affairs, by news. And I don't think there's a single person at PBS who would not agree with that statement from the very top on down. But I think that the next step is really trying to figure out, okay, if you really want those audiences, what do you have to do to get them? Like, that's just, it's like the basic question, but I think that it speaks to a lot, because if you really want those audiences, then you have to commit to put things that they want to see on the air. You have to commit to funding those things, or you have to commit to having your foundation development and major gifts teams cultivate funders who want to support that stuff. You know, like we sort of talked about, the funding model is really difficult because we all know who the majority of funders are, separate from foundations, but like individual givers, like they don't look like this panel. And so there's a lot of work that has to be done to either cultivate that community to be givers and supporters, or figure out like who are the people out there who are aligned with the mission and also want to see this programming out there. But then it's also just like, look at the system. If this is what you say that you want, do your actions back it up, right? Like going back to that, to the marketing, to the promotion, to the commissioning, like, are you aligning all of that stuff that you're doing and all of your resources with what you want the outcome to be? And if the answer is no, then you got to step back and figure it out so that the answer becomes yes.
Thank you. Well, on that note, I'd like to thank you amazing panelists and all the attendees. I think there are a lot of very clear strategic conversations we can have. Hopefully some really good concrete ideas came out of this, and we can broaden the strategy and who's at the table in terms of what public media is committed to and what we can all work towards. So first of all, I'd like to thank Firelight Media, Justin, Monica, Nicole, and Marcia for the partnership on this Beyond Resilience panel. Also, our CAAM colleagues, Sapna Badatri, Stephen, and Zarina, as well as the CAAMFest team, Crystal, Jesse, and Masashi, for all the great work. You know, we certainly hope this is put a lot of good ideas in public media's minds, and that this year, that we can really look back on this year as a year in which a lot of great change and structural strategies were built and put in place. So thank you again. Just briefly, I was told to mention there's a happy hour hosted by Real South and Novak that we hope the attendees can join. So again, thank you everybody for joining today's panel, and look forward to the next time.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, everybody.